there's so many different connections in the body between all the different bodily systems. And unfortunately, modern medicine, we're pushed into specialties that are essentially silos. And it's very infrequent that you would find a doctor who's really dealing with a person as a whole. We tend to just distill problems down into diagnoses rather than actually looking at underlying causes, which is a bit more of a functional medicine approach to think about.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Carnivore Revolution. Today I have with me Dr. Brown, and Dr. Brown is the author of the book Metabolic Madness: Understand Why Metabolic Health is Key to Mental Health. Dr. Brown specializes in metabolic health and is a certified functional medicine practitioner. And I'm excited about this one because there is such a huge connection between the brain and what we eat, and people just don't talk about that.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, Serena. It's a pleasure to come on and talk about this stuff.
Thank you so much for joining me. So let's just start out with the basics. Like, what made you start eating this way? Like, when did you realize this would make a difference and start doing it yourself?
Oh gosh, I've kind of been in the low carb world for, I don't know, more than 20 years. So going back to university days, but then was a bit on and off with Atkins in the beginning, and for various reasons, one of which was a sugar addiction. But the sort of Atkins treats and so on derailed me a lot in those days. But I've just always had an interest in holistic health and lifestyle measures, and particularly just about diet and what we should be eating. And around about kind of 11 years ago, I really got into the primal health movement. So not quite paleo, but primal and Marxist. And then just gradually over the years, I kind of got lower and lower carb and eventually keto. And I thought, okay, I'm going to make a real effort to be strictly keto. And I'd never measured ketones before. But it was partly for some health reasons within my family. So someone close to me who had a neurodegenerative condition diagnosed, and I just thought, okay, I need to get a bit more serious about my own health. Went keto, and then it was ketogenic girl, or Vanessa Spina. She must have been doing a carnivore experiment at some point in time, and I remember just seeing her plate of food on Instagram and thinking, what on earth is she doing? And that was my first introduction to carnivore, because I had never come across it before, just in the health space. Despite being keto and trawling through different keto accounts and so on social media. But that was my first introduction to carnivore, and I really respect her views on things. And I'd listened to a lot of her podcasts and knew that she was into the science of everything. So that was my first awareness of carnivore. And then I watched a talk by Sean Baker at Carnivore on YouTube. And then the other talk I watched was by Michaela Peterson and her personal story. And after I'd watched the two of those, that was me just convinced. I thought I need to give this a go. And it wasn't for any particular health reasons myself. It was purely curiosity that got me into carnivore.
It's so interesting how different people come to the carnivore diet, because I would say like 75% of people saw Sean Baker's podcast with Joe Rogan. It's how most people found it.
Yeah, that wasn't the one I watched, but yeah, I see most people quoting the Joe Rogan podcast. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so funny. So now, can you tell us simply, in a way that normal people can understand, exactly how does what we eat affect our brain?
Oh gosh. Yeah, so I've been working as a conventional psychiatrist for years at this point. So since 2014 is when I started working in psychiatry, and we've heard for so many years psychiatrists and people in the media bang on and on about neurotransmitters. And there's been this whole theory about neurotransmitter imbalances when it comes to any kind of mental health issue. Personally, I think the science has moved on, and that's just a small piece of the puzzle. And there are many other things that we could talk about that are also relevant to mental health. But if we were to just start with neurotransmitters, they're made from what we eat, essentially. And I've got a huge interest in the gut-brain connection. So gut health is just absolutely key. I think you'd be hard pushed to find a functional medicine trained practitioner who doesn't at least know some of the importance of gut health. But Most of our neurotransmitters are produced within the gut by the bacteria in our gut. And there's also other connections between the gut and the brain. But essentially, it's hard to keep it simple because it is such a complex subject. But if you were to take leaky gut as one example, so our intestine wall is very thin. It's made up of single cells, and there are gaps between these cells called tight junctions. And we know from the research that there are certain foods that can open up these tight junctions and give you leaky gut. And that just means when anything within your gut is able to cross over the intestine wall and then get into your systemic bloodstream. So one of those things that does it is gluten or wheat. So it's particularly the gliadin component, so part of the wheat protein that opens up those tight junctions. And that just sets off a whole cascade of an immune response and inflammation elsewhere in the body. So once you have potentially bacterial toxins crossing the gut wall, but also foreign particles from food or other toxins that may be within your gut, once that gets into your bloodstream and starts to travel elsewhere in the body, your body mounts an immune response, and that's when you start to get inflammation. And we know these days that inflammation is hugely key to mental health disorders. And there's also data to show quite clearly that if you have a leaky gut, you can also end up having a leaky brain. And that really just refers to the blood-brain barrier, which is actually fairly similar in function and structure to the gut barrier. So that surrounds your brain and protects it. And sort of regulates essentially what enters your brain and also what exits your brain. And we know that when people have leaky gut, that sort of signaling cascade that comes from the immune system can end up also giving you a leaky blood-brain barrier. And it's the same sort of single cell makeup in the blood-brain barrier. And there are certain disorders such as autism, for example. There's quite clear data from post-mortem studies of brains and bowel showing that people with autism are more likely to have leaky gut and alterations in their blood-brain barrier function as well. But I'm sure it also applies across the board in terms of other mental disorders as well.
And how important is your gut, as far as its health goes, for things like autoimmune diseases?
Oh yeah, absolutely key, because it's the same process that happens essentially. So if you have leaky gut, and there can be a bit of a genetic component to that, but it can be, even stress, just psychological stress gives you a leaky gut as well. But if you're making lifestyle choices that increase your gut permeability, then that opens up the opportunity for the immune system to start to overreact to things, so foreign particles or toxins or whatever it may be. And this is what can trigger off autoimmune reactions as well.
Yeah. And so, the thing, and obviously this isn't going to be something that you actually absolutely have the answer to, but do doctors, like conventional doctors, do they just not know these things? I mean, why are doctors not talking about this, do you think?
Oh gosh, big question. So I think a lot of them don't know these things. I think the way medicine has been set up or progressed over the years, unfortunately, there's a huge focus on pharmaceutical interventions. So I think medical education has been shaped very significantly by the pharmaceutical industry. And certainly the way in which I was trained, it was to make a diagnosis and then prescribe a medication. But there wasn't very much thought given to what are the actual underlying causes and what might be going on sort of biochemically and at a molecular level within the body, and about the different hormone systems, and seeing the body as a holistic whole, and how your hormones in terms of your adrenal function and your stress hormones, that impacts on your thyroid, and it impacts on your pituitary, and all of it impacts you. There's so many different connections in the body between all the different bodily systems. And unfortunately, modern medicine, we're pushed into specialties that are essentially silos, and it's very infrequent that you would find a doctor who's really dealing with a person as a whole. We tend to just distill problems down into diagnoses rather than actually looking at underlying causes. which is a bit more of a functional medicine approach to think about the person as a whole and the underlying abnormalities or imbalances that there might be.
And do you think that most things can be cured or at least helped with a low carb diet?
Yes, absolutely. So I think diet is absolutely fundamental, and it's probably it is the first thing to start with. I was about to say probably there, but actually no, I think it is the first thing to start with. And I think it's not necessarily a one size fits all for every person, because people come with their own health backgrounds and different environmental toxicities, and heavy metal burdens can be one aspect and underlying infections can be another aspect, and everybody's got a slightly unique microbiome. And there's still a lot that we don't know, but no two microbiomes are going to be exactly the same when you compare them. And so I think it varies from individual to individual, which might explain why some people do very well on a ketogenic diet, for example, in terms of their mental health. But then there still will be a cohort of people where a ketogenic diet doesn't fix all of their symptoms. And I know personally some people who tried keto, it didn't work for them, and then they managed to resolve many years of symptoms of severe mental illness by going down a carnivore route.
It's interesting how even just that little bit of vegetables or fruit or items that are not, on the carnivore diet can make a difference for people. What do you think the worst culprits are in our diets today that are adding fuel to the fire of mental illnesses and just illnesses in general?
Oh yeah, so that's easy. Seed oils would be one of them. And I mean, I'm a gluten, I just think shouldn't really be in anybody's diet. That's a huge one for me. But just the sugar, and all carbs break down into simple sugars. So it's a misnomer to look at complex carbs and think healthy whole grains, for example, because once your body digests it, everything breaks down into sugar. So there's a huge amount of inflammation that comes from having chronically high insulin levels over many years that eventually results in insulin resistance. That's a huge aspect of mental health as well as all other chronic conditions. But then the seed oils just are so inflammatory in themselves and completely skew your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio and promote inflammation in their own right. So yeah, those two.
So as a functional medicine practitioner, what kind of mental health issues have you seen people do better with on a lower carb or carnivore diet?
So yeah, so I'm going to be going into do some private practice in functional medicine, but at the current time I'm full-time NHS in the UK. So I've been working just within conventional psychiatry. I have started up a small-scale metabolic psychiatry clinic where I work. So I have had a few people come through that, and it has been people with major mental illness, so either bipolar disorder or a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And it's probably too early to say because it's fairly small scale, but certainly I think the people who could really benefit from adopting a ketogenic way of life are the people with major mental illness. But also there's just so many people that I don't tend to come across in my day-to-day work. So I know there's a huge burden of illness out there in terms of anxiety and depression who never make it into secondary care services, and actually all of those people as well. I'm not a huge fan of our diagnostic system. So I would just view all of these disorders as being an outward symptom of an underlying dysfunction, and of which there may be multiple different causes.
So what about, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I just wish people would get less hung up on diagnoses or our classification systems, because they're not perfect by any means.
Yeah, so let's talk about different kinds of brain stuff like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia. What do you think about those and the use of like fat and or a ketogenic or carnivore diet to help people with those kinds of diagnoses?
Oh yeah, I'm absolutely all for that. And there's a lot of good data out there now. In fact, probably most of the research we have in relation to insulin resistance in the brain, most of the research relates to Alzheimer's disease. And we know that the vast majority of people with Alzheimer's have either frank type 2 diabetes, or they have insulin resistance in the form of pre-diabetes. Unfortunately, we don't routinely test, certainly not in the NHS. We don't test a HOMA-IR score, for example, which is a score of your level of insulin resistance. And you need a fasting insulin to be able to check that. But we know that in Alzheimer's and dementia that the vast majority have an insulin resistant brain, and it means they just have really sluggish processing of glucose within the brain, because the brain cells aren't really able to access insulin, or insulin isn't able to perform its usual function and to be able to get that energy into the brain cells. And we know that when people adopt nutritional ketosis or a ketogenic diet, that this provides an alternative fuel source for the brain. We know that ketones can cross the blood-brain barrier and get into the brain and fuel the brain and make up for any energy deficits that were there as a result of insulin resistance. And we know that there are many therapeutic benefits to ketone bodies as well, just being anti-inflammatory, essentially, is what it comes down to, and reducing oxidative stress, which is another term people may have heard of.
Yeah, and I've seen studies where people that have really low cholesterol that are diagnosed with something like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, that if we can raise their cholesterol a little bit, that tends to get better. What do you think about that?
Oh, well, yeah, because the brain is absolutely loaded with cholesterol. So I would never tell somebody to go on cholesterol lowering medication for quite a number of different reasons, but brain health, absolutely. I think you need to have an adequate level of cholesterol, and I just think artificially lowering it is spelling trouble, particularly in relation to your cognition and ability to think and process properly in the future. And I think the whole cholesterol heart hypothesis, things have moved on since that one.
Yeah, and people still have such a hard time with that, though. Like, I talk to people like on a daily basis, whether it's in person or online, that say, "What about your vitamins and nutrients?" You know, as if those of us that are eating this way haven't already done the research and found that we can absolutely get the vitamins and nutrients. But there are so many people that are still so confused about this and so afraid of fat.
I think that just comes from years and years of conditioning. So the messages that we are given, from the television and in other forms of media, we're just bombarded with this stuff and have been for decades, a lot of us. And it does take a bit of time to rewire how your brain thinks about things and unlearn some of the bad information that we've been given. I remember when I started out in Carnivore, we were on holiday, and it was a buffet type restaurant, and I remember putting lots of meat on my plate, and then because I just sort of launched myself into it really quickly, because that's the sort of person that I am, I remember putting a few mushrooms on the plate as well, and thinking, oh, there was just this psychological barrier, like, can I just have a plate of meat, like, or like, what's going to happen? It was fear of the unknown.
Yeah, and we are completely bombarded on social media, in ads, on TV, and everywhere with all of this plant-based stuff. Everybody is pushing so much plant-based stuff, and I can't wrap my mind around how somebody could look at a container of like some sort of plant-based butter or country crock, or something like that, and think that could possibly be healthier than a stick of butter, when the butter just has, the one or two ingredients, whether you get it salted or not. And how somebody could look at that long list of ingredients where something is manufactured and almost the entire thing is man-made, and feel like that's healthier because the TV told me to, or because Kim Kardashian told me to, or whatever.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or just because it says on the front of the packet that it's healthy. That's another one. Yeah, I think the further away from nature that we get, the more problems we bring upon ourselves. And that applies to food as well as lifestyle more generally. So the artificial light and screens and abnormal amount of blue light that we all expose ourselves to, and then avoiding the sun because we're told that that's such a bad thing. Again, you just, I don't know about you, but the longer I do this and the more I research things, the more it just becomes obvious that it's almost as if everything that we've been told, it's the inverse that's actually true.
Like, sometimes people will say to me, why don't you want to just be normal like other people? And I look around at the other people, and my immediate response is no. Those people, most of them are sick. Most of them don't feel well. Most of them hit snooze 4 times, on their alarm before they wake up. because they can't get out of bed. They have to sit on the end of the bed for, multiple minutes before they can get up in the morning while their body wakes up. And I couldn't sleep past my alarm and hit snooze if I wanted to. Most of the time I wake up before my alarm goes off now, which has never happened to me in my entire life. My husband, a couple of my kids, they have that internal clock where they can set their alarm and wake up before it. I cannot do that. But somehow, or I've never been able to, but somehow I am almost always waking up before my alarm now. It's just amazing what your body can do if you give it that chance. But I don't want to be like other people. I don't want to be normal.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone was asking me about carnivore recently and just how long I'd been carnivore. And I said to them, oh, I might not have launched myself into it so quickly had I thought that I would never go back to eating anything sort of more normal again. And then as I said it, I thought to myself, actually, I don't think I really mean that, because there have just been so many benefits to this lifestyle that I don't really think about straying or having sweet things again or anything like that. And I don't miss any of it. And it's the first time in my life that well, for the last 4 years, but I've been able to be around all those sorts of foods and look at them and have absolutely no desire to eat any of it. It's very freeing.
Yeah, it flips a switch in your brain. It's just this amazing thing that happens once it's that carnivore zen, this feeling that you get, like that's all you need is the meat, the eggs, a little bit of cheese, and just go about your merry way. But I don't want to be normal. I don't want to be like 50% of Americans or more, that are sick and not feeling well. I want to feel my best. And this is how I feel my best. If that means being different than everybody else, then that's fine. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I do worry about the way they seem to be normalizing sickness in many shapes and forms these days. So I suppose obesity might be one of them, and the whole sort of body positivity movement. And I think there are things that I admire about that, so certain sentiments of it that I admire. But I really worry about the glamorization of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, and we have an absolute epidemic of it. And yet, you just need to speak to people saying, oh, 30 years ago, looking around, the population didn't look the way it does now. And I think that's just happening in so many different aspects of life these days, and it is a concern, and it is all coming from the media and television.
Yeah, and the amount of sicknesses, we didn't have nearly the amount of sicknesses then that we have now. Those two things are absolutely connected to each other. Yeah. It's just so hard to teach people. People really and truly don't believe, I think, that the food is our fuel, and that what we eat affects every cell in our body.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking, I was at a conference recently in Sheffield in the UK, and Dr. Georgia Eid was there speaking. So it was amazing to hear her in person, although I knew her already from having trained with her before. But one thing that really stuck with me that she said that I hadn't quite fully appreciated was that when we have a lot of seed oils in our diary, so think in our diet, I'm thinking about the omega-6 proportion that is in the seed oil, so the inflammatory component, like linoleic acid, for example. She said when your brain burns that, it actually increases the oxidative stress within your brain. So she spoke about how the brain cells, what they tend to do with the linoleic acid is they burn it, although they're not designed to burn it as fuel, and then it essentially exacerbates one of the main problems that causes mental illness. And that's just one tiny example of the past. I forget exactly how many years that those seed oils have been in the diet, but it's quite a number of decades now. And you just need to look at those trends on a graph, and it tallies up entirely with the trends in chronic illnesses that we have now.
So now tell me, what does a typical day of eating look like for you?
Okay, so when I started out, I was deliberately trying to fast, and I used to skip breakfast and just have 2 meals a day. And I did that for quite a long time, and ended up closing my eating window probably to about 6 hours in a day. And that felt okay to me. But more recently, just because I've developed more of an interest in circadian health and rhythms, I made a conscious effort not to skip breakfast. So I've started having 3 meals again a day, but making sure I eat in the mornings. And so it varies. I eat a fair bit of bacon, eggs, and beef. And I'd say the majority of my diet tends to center around ruminant meat. So mostly beef, sometimes lamb. And that's, in a variety of forms. So just minced beef or burgers or steaks. And I eat a bit of fish now and again when I feel like it, but that's pretty much what I've gravitated towards. And then I've discovered along the way, I'm not all that great with cow dairy, although I can tolerate ghee. So I use a fair bit of ghee in my diet as well.
So if you had one piece of advice for somebody who either needs the carnivore diet or is considering starting the carnivore diet or some sort of a low carb diet like that, what's the one piece of advice you would give somebody?
I think to include foods that you enjoy. I think that's really important. I think possibly if I could go back, I would have done carnivore a bit differently had I known better when I started. So I think I was doing a lot of leaner meats and then having cheese and cream and relying quite heavily on dairy in the beginning. And that helped me get through the beginning. But actually, over time, I just gravitated towards fattier cuts of meat. And I would say that's where it's at. So if you're somebody who is able to eat fat that comes with meat, because I know some people have aversion type issues after years of avoiding that. But really just fattier cuts of red meat should be one of the main focuses, I would say, if you're doing carnivore, that is, and to make sure you just eat enough.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
I don't know about you. I find that quite difficult in the beginning. I went through a stage of almost feeling a bit nauseated by eating meat, but I just kept going. And then over time, I've surprised myself at just my ability to be able to eat meat now and really enjoy it. So there is just an adaptation period where you have to get used to things. And obviously your body's going through a fair bit of change as well.
Thank you so much for joining me. I learned so much today. Your brain health information is just wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been nice chatting.
And we'll see you next time here on the Carnivore Revolution.